Good morning, everyone, and good morning to everyone who's watching via technology. This morning's panel is going to be fascinating, and I know you all are going to have a great time. I'm not used to having this many people show up to see me without a court order, so I'm certain this is going to be fabulous. Our panel discussion this morning is by the book. Our moderator is Pamela Paul. Joining Ms. Paul are authors Ann Patchett, Nicholson Baker, Francine Prose, and Walter Mosley. Ms. Paul is the editor of the New York Times Book Review and of the popular interview column By the Book. Her new book, By the Books, Writers on Literature and the Literary Life by the New York Times Book Review, brings together 65 of the most intriguing and fascinating exchanges over time. She's joined this morning by Ann Patchett, who's the author of 6 novels, as well as the co-owner of a bookstore. Yay for bookstores. Her newest book is This is the Story of a Happy Marriage, a memoir, and before the publication of her first novel, she labored in the trenches at 17 magazine. Nicholson Baker is the author of 10 novels, including Human Smoke. His latest is In the Paul Chowder Chronicles, where poet-protagonist Paul Chowder appears again. He is joined by Francine Prose, who's the author of 20 works of fiction. Her latest book is Lovers at the Chameleon Club, Paris, 1932, a novel set in Paris in the 1920s. Also on the panel this morning is Walter Mosley, who's the author of more than 40 books, most notably, and I'm certain there's some fans in the audience, of the E.Z. Rollins Mystery Series. His later is Rose Gold and E.Z. Rollins Mystery. The story takes place during the Patty Hearst era of radical black nationalism and political abductions. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel.
So in 2012, when I started By the Book, I had a few motivations. While I would like to believe, as the editor of the book review, that the only reason people ever buy books is based on their book reviews, especially those in the New York Times, I know that occasionally there are other reasons people pick up a book. And one of the ones that's most commonly cited is word of mouth. It's the book that everyone's talking about in the office. It's the book that your best friend recommends. It's the book that is the current controversy. So I thought, well, how do I get at that word of the mouth in the book review? And I came up with this idea that I kind of think of as a dorkier and cheaper red carpet question, what are you wearing? Where I would ask the people that we read, what are you reading and why? And what are the books that matter to you? And I thought of this while at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. David Sedaris was giving a talk, and he always, when he goes around on his speaking tours, recommends a book. And I thought that's so incredibly kind and generous. And it's not always a funny book, but then I thought, well, what are the funniest books that you've ever read, David Sedaris? So he was actually the first person I asked to do a By the Book, which is now booked through 2015. It's become so popular with authors and also with other non-writers who I think sometimes like to show that they too like to read. And I feel like one of the times where I knew that it was truly working, other than the fact that people wanted to be in the column, was on 3 separate occasions, bookstore owners told me that customers had come into the store with Ann Patchett's page torn out and titles highlighted saying, I want these. And one person who just said, I want everything that Ann Patchett recommends. So I have 4 great authors here, all of whom have done By the Book. I feel like there's a spectrum of authors where there are those writers on the one end who can talk endlessly about their book. If you ask them to come to a reading, they will come and they will talk about their book. They will talk about their book while they're in the bathroom stall. They will talk about their book whenever given an opportunity. And then on the other end, there are people like, Thomas Pynchon, who will never talk about their books. And in the vast middle are authors who will talk about their books, but also get sick of talking about their books. So this is an occasion for these writers here to talk not about their books, but about other people's books. And I thought I would open it up. I should say that we should buy the book as something that people have a lot of time to think over and to come up with the exact answer of, what book was the most important to them as a child. And here is kind of on the spot, and nobody has cheat sheets in front of them. So as someone with a terrible memory, I just want to issue that excuse for everyone here in case they don't remember the exact answer to their question. But here's an easy one that I'll start with, which is, what did you read on your way to the Miami Book Fair? And we can just go down the line. Anne?
The Buried Giant, which, because I own a bookstore, I only read books that won't be out until March. But I'm reading the new Ishiguro book. It's called The Buried Giant. It will be out in March. So unlikely. It's medieval. It's got ogres and dragons in it. I would never have wanted to read this book. And I can't put it down. I got up at 5 o'clock this morning so I could read for a couple of hours.
And this is how you know that Anne is a bookseller, because within 2 minutes of my seeing her yesterday, she was waving the galley at me.
I want to make sure it gets a good review placement.
The true hand seller. Nick?
I was reading, I still use this app on the plane. You've got to, it's nice to have a machine, so I have this app that is now, I think, abandoned by the app maker called Eucalyptus, and I was reading George Saintsbury's criticism. What can I tell you? He's a 19th century omnivorous book reader. He's read every single thing that anyone has written in French or English or Greek or Latin, and he has this wonderful kind of flowing style that helps me think. So when I want to say things fluently, which I was worried about saying today, I think, well, let me read some Saintsbury, and it helps me. Not so much as it should, but.
Well, for reasons that are probably too dark and personal and weird to go into, I've been on a huge Thomas Bernhardt kick. So I was reading The Woodcutters on the way down. But I was reading it in a strange way, because I realized when I woke up early in the morning to catch an early flight that I was reading it on a Kindle, that I had a little tiny bar, so I was afraid it was going to run out. So for some reason, instead of doing the obvious thing, which was just to read it until it ran out, I'd read a few pages and then do the Sudoku puzzle in the Delta magazine, and then I'd read a few more pages. So it was a kind of going back and forth was. In a way, I thought Thomas Bernhardt would have loved it, if he loved anything.
Yeah, I have it next to me because it's hard for me to remember the title. The Warhound and the World's Pain by Michael Moorcock, which he wrote in 1981. I started reading Moorcock when I was 16 on an American Institute for Foreign Study trip to England. And I just loved, and I realized when I started reading him that I loved his language, and this is one of his books, and he's written like 100, but this is one of them that I hadn't read, and I just kind of, I love it because of he's a science fiction mystery writer, but science fiction fantasy writer, but what he does, he asks these questions which I've always found like really interesting. Like in this one, there's a soldier who didn't want to be a soldier but became a very evil soldier who somehow became under the purview of Satan. But Satan has decided that he doesn't like being Satan anymore. He wants to go back to heaven, and he needs this guy to go out and find a way for him to get back into heaven. I just kind of love that. These are the kind of problems that I feel like I live with all the time in a very pedestrian way, but I like to think of it in a larger way.
These answers are kind of the bookseller's nightmare or the book publicist's nightmare in that all of them are either books that came out long ago or one that's not out yet. But I'm curious because everybody, Walter consulted a gadget or was that an actual book?
Oh,
That's an actual book.
It's
okay.
actually the book.
But
see?
You admitted to reading on a Kindle. I'm just curious about how people read. Do you use a device? Do you still read old-fashioned books? Do you write in your books? What are your book habits?
Books, paper, always. I own a bookstore, right? You
She's
get
got a
that.
vested interest in this.
Right.
Well, I have this thing that I like doing. I get up in the morning and go and drive somewhere, and I have a stack of books in the back seat, and I pull them in the front, and I read aloud from them. And somehow reading aloud in an empty car to myself from the book on paper helps me. Now, in the middle of the night, it's a whole different thing, because in the middle of the night, you don't want to wake your wife up or your spouse up, so I usually read in the hours between 3, 4, and 5.
Or to get committed, you know.
I read, on an iPhone, because it's a lovely little machine, and when it flops over, it doesn't hit you in the head like an iPad.
I guess the sales of that itsy bitsy book light that used to, be the big thing probably have plummeted with the iPhone.
I'm sorry for the itty bitty book light. That was a lovely thing.
I only read on a device on an airplane, because I used to travel with 100 pounds of books, because God forbid I got stuck in an airport somewhere. So now I don't have to do that. But as I said in the column, my favorite place to read is in the passenger seat of a car going really fast up the New York State Thruway.
Wow.
Ladies and gentlemen, someone who does not get car sick when doing that.
That's
Thank
amazing. It's interesting, I mean, because the question, there's another question inside of it, it's like, it's like loving cell phones but being against killing people in Congo, I mean, either you like cell phones or you don't like killing people in Congo. You can't like both. If you're on your cell phone, you're raping women, and we are all on cell phones, so I mean, what are you gonna say?
What are you talking about?
The main chemical in cell
Of course,
phones
of course.
is mined in Congo, and the reason that their polity doesn't work is because people are making profit off them, and they don't want a democratic nation stopping them from getting the cheapest possible coltan to put in their cell phones. And the same thing about books. I much prefer reading books in paper, and I do mostly. But I'm so excited about electronic books because children who can't afford books can download thousands of Dickens, Twain, Hugo, all those things onto their little devices and read them and not have to pay for them and not have to murder millions of trees. So it goes both ways.
They can go to the library, too. Just saying.
When you live in the hood, there's many other issues that come up that don't come up in other places.
The thing about murdering trees, though, I live in Maine, and there's so many trees.
You've got trees to spare up there.
And really, when you stop cutting down the trees and making paper with them, they're closing big paper manufacturing places. When you cut down the trees, when you stop cutting down the trees and making paper, then what happens is little condominium developers sprout up. Those are the real kind of enemies of those are the real engines of sprawl. So you've got to keep buying things on paper in order to save the forest.
All the political issues involved in ebooks versus print books that you didn't even think of. Walter, this is a bit of a cheat because I already know your answer to this, but who else reads in the bathtub?
Who else?
Who else? Because I know you do.
Oh, God, who else reads in the bathtub? I don't know.
Anyone else here a bathtub reader?
Oh, okay.
Oh.
No, you do.
One of them.
That's one of
I've
the
lost too many books to drowning.
drowning.
Yeah.
I mean, the drowned Kindle, I think, is almost a life-threatening
Oh, that's really bad, yeah.
situation. There was a question that someone stopped and asked in my own
out the truth about something. And that it's much more fun to have a pursuit. So you're led to books that you never would have looked at otherwise, except that you need to find out some tiny piece of, or in my case, say it was a build-up to World War II or whatever it was. And so having a quest helps order this impossibly, intimidatingly enormous universe of books and helps sort things for me.
I read because I love to read, and as I get older, it's really the most important thing in my life. It's the thing I plan my day around, the thing I always want to be doing. It's the thing that I love the most.
When
I don't want to go anywhere anymore. I don't want to travel. I don't want to go out to dinner. I don't want to see friends. I just really want to read.
There was an author's party here last night, and I asked
didn't
Anne
go
if she was
because I
going.
read.
She said, "Are you kidding?" And again, waved the buried giant in the air. Francine?
Well, even when I was a little kid, it seemed so unfair to me that you only got one life. So reading, in a way, takes away the sting of that. You get all these others that you get to inhabit briefly.
One of the things that came out in the conversation at my book club was that answer can change depending on sort of where you are in your own life, that at a certain point, maybe after a tragedy, you find that you only want to read to escape, or you want to read to be transported. Other times you want to read about sort of people going through a similar thing. And I wonder if you have found that your reading needs or desires have shifted over the course of your life.
I'm not sure I'm going to answer that question, but something that you just said. My brother-in-law died. My sister's husband died in January, and he was one of my best friends. It was just a horrible loss. And I started reading the saddest books I could find. Wave.
Yes, the Nali Dharmanyagala. Amazing.
So helpful. So helpful. To just sink in with other people's sadnesses and loss. Brother, I'm Dying, Edwidge, The Suicide Index, Joan Wickersham, which is such a fantastic book. I can't recommend it enough. It was like going to see your friends and saying, we're just going to sit together.
Raise your hand if you misery read. Does anyone else out there?
Misery read.
Misery read. You read about other people sadder and more troubled than you are. I'm going to go back to the question. Have the reasons that you've read changed depending on where you were in your life?
I really like reading. I like to dip into things. And there's this writer who used to write for The New Yorker named Maeve Brennan. She was the long-winded lady. I love this woman. She would write a long paragraph. It was usually one single paragraph in the Talk of the Town section. And she would just go into a restaurant and describe who walked into the restaurant. She wouldn't actually talk to them. She would just have speculations about them. Or she would be riding the subway and would see someone reading a magazine, and she would talk. And she is just such a beautiful, beautiful describer. It's really thrilling to see somebody. So I think that my motive in reading The Long-Winded Lady is just to imagine myself back in New York City in the 60s and, riding the subway and looking at life, looking at New York and feeling the New Yorker when it was a big-time thing, but feeling New York when it was a different place. And so the motive is, I guess, escape, but it's also this desire to be immediately with a person with a beautiful mind standing in a subway and looking at somebody.
Lately, and this may have something to do with the Thomas Bernhard thing, I find myself drawn to writers who seem to me to be kind of outrageous, envelope-pushing weirdos of one sort or another, because I think there's so much pressure.
Are we going to name names?
I could go on. I mean, Roberto Bolaño, 2666, Hans Christian Andersen, Jane Bowles, on and on. Because I think there's so much pressure on writers now still, the way there is pressure on everybody to do something that's conforming or to write the tidy, well-made, conventional novel. And to read writers who make you say, oh, I didn't know you could do that. I guess you can do that is extremely helpful.
Walter?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an answer to your question. I don't know. I don't feel like, I mean, my reading may indeed change because of my situation, but I'm not keeping track of it.
Do you, how do you decide what to read next?
Well, I have some books on my shelf, and of course, as I said, the big thing about reading is rereading. I have a wonderful friend named Manthia Diawara who lectures at NYU, and one day I was looking at his books, the books that he lectures from, and he's read those books, like each one, 100 times. And when he's rereading it, when he's teaching a class, if I happen to be around him, he starts talking to me about the book as if he just read it for the first time. And so there's 100 or 200 books that I do a lot of rereading of. I just sit down and say, well, it's time for 100 Years of Solitude again. Let me see where I can go with that. I feel the same thing about movies, but that's another panel.
What other books do you like to reread? What other books do you like to reread?
Well, there's a few of Marquez that I think is wonderful. The Dead Souls by Gogol, I'm always kind of amazed in some of his short stories. Camus, only a few, only The Stranger and The Plague. I just kind of go over them again and again, always finding new stuff, and poetry, the Four Quartets by Eliot. I still haven't understood it, but I really like reading it. And my misunderstanding changes as I reread.
Francine, do you reread?
Yeah. And yeah. I mean, I just wrote a piece for you, but I reread the Russians a lot. I reread Chekhov as often as I can. And actually, I'm trying to write something now about trying to reread Chekhov and everything else getting in the way.
We have a Russian issue of the book review coming next weekend, sort of Thanksgiving counter-programming. And Francine wrote an essay about answering the question, what's so great about Russian literature? Why do we keep returning to the 19th century Russian novelists? Do you reread?
I reread Green Eggs and Ham all the time. Actually, my mother taught me to read. I was kind of a late reader, and my mother was worried about me because I think first grade was looming, and I couldn't read, and so she gave me Green Eggs and Ham to read. And I had this horrible time with it. Words like look, and especially I remember crying over the word dark because I'd learned that ah and a were the two sounds that a made, and here was this hybrid sound, R. And I got to the end of it, and she made me green eggs and ham with food coloring. And it tasted good, but it looked very strange. No, I like to read, truly like to read, go back to read. Dr. Seuss is good. But Vladimir Nabokov Speak Memory is the book that I always go back to. And it is actually a supernatural book, I have to say. It is an accordion book because I have read the book sort of through. I guess I've read every page, but not in order. But I dip in, and it's as if I haven't read that page. There's always some piece of it that I'm reading for the first time. It actually is a miraculous book that way. Speak Memory.
Do you have time to reread, Anne?
I don't anymore. I used to. I used to reread James all the time. I'm a big James person, and it's gone now. I read not only things that were written. I don't read things that are written a long time ago. I read things that haven't been published yet.
Do you find that you do certain reading for work and you do certain reading for pleasure, or does it totally overlap and meld together?
It's all the same, because all books are pleasure for me, and if they're not, I stop reading them. We have at the bookstore a first editions club, so we're always thinking about what book we're going to be picking in 3 or 4 months, and everyone at the store is fiercely reading, and there's this feeling of trying to hold back the wave all the time. Okay, we've got February picked, but what about March? What about April? So.
All right, you brought up, it can't be all lovey-dovey, you brought up putting things down that you didn't love. Are you willing to name sort of the last book that you picked up and couldn't finish or didn't want to?
I don't even know that I looked at the cover, but it probably happens 5 times a day. I mean, no joke, every single day of my life, people are sending books to my house, people are sending books to me through the bookstore. It's never ending. People want me to read their books, and if something doesn't catch me really fast. Unless it's a friend or it's come with a personal recommendation, I don't give it much of a chance at all.
Nick, what about you? Do you feel the need to get to the end of every book, or do you put things down?
I love that sound when you're in a bookstore and you open a book and you read the first 5 lines and then you whop it closed. No, no, we've read that, it's done, it's dumb, forget it, go back. So I do that a lot. But then sometimes, I hate saying bad things about other books in any specific way. So that's why I've stopped writing book reviews. I just think it's unkind. There's a huge world of books, and everybody has a different universe of interests. And I've gone through phases where I've loved certain books that I now don't love as much, and I've also discovered books in my 50s that I thought I would never, ever read. So it's always a mistake, I think, to say bad things about other people's books because you never know what phase someone else is going to be in. So I just say that, yes, I do reject a lot of books.
One of the things about negative book reviews is that I think there are occasions, certainly it's happened with me, where I've read someone lambasting a book and ended up disliking the reviewer more than I disliked the book, and then actually kind of wanting to read the book because I disliked what that reviewer had to say. Francine, you did not write negative reviews for many, many years and have only recently returned to that art, that dark art.
There's a part sort of around middle age where I was saying, well, that's something young people do. They just trash everything and they have no conscience about it. But now it just seems to me that there's I'll just say it. I mean, there's so many crappy books out there that are taken seriously as great books that I just feel I can't not say it. Some Tourette's-like part of me just keeps wanting to say, bad, 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 bad. So
I want to go back to, if
I
not...
want to say something about that.
Yes.
Yeah, I know I hear at the end, but there's a book recently written, a so-called nonfiction book, which said all of this really irresponsible stuff about Ebola, that you could catch it from the air, that it's about to destroy America. It was a real fear-mongering book, and a lot of the things that it said were not true, written by somebody who had to change his name at least once. And it got a really bad review. I think it was in Salon. I'm not sure. I think it was in Salon. And I kind of applauded that bad review. I think that there are certain times, there's certain books that say certain things that maybe you want to say something against. But that's never about technique or story or that kind of stuff. But there are things that books do that deserve to be countered, I think.
I want to say something that bring up a topic that will give solace to many worried parents and grandparents out there about what their little ones are reading. Walter, you started off reading comic books as a child.
Yeah.
What was it that appealed to you about comics?
Well, it seemed like they understood my life.
You were a superhero.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to be a superhero, and I wanted, understand, like Spider-Man especially. I just figured that he was like a black kid, all this power, all this ability, can't make any money. When he does make money, it's by making fun of himself. The police are after him. The public fear him. But he does kind of wonderful things in life. I think, wow, that's me. I thought the same thing about The Thing and the Fantastic Four. And all the stories were really, they were living out, my physical, desires and fantasies. And so I thought they were beautiful and very artistic. And I still do, I love them.
Francine, what did you read growing up?
Well, on the subject of comics, I read comics also. I loved Mad Magazine when I was a kid. I thought, finally, someone has the same sense of humor as me, unlike my family. And then I just read everything. I was completely omnivorous. And not until I was in high school, I don't think that anyone told me or I knew the difference between a so-called good book and a so-called bad book. I just didn't care. I'd read all these big popular novels. James Michener, I didn't know the difference between James Michener and Henry James. I mean, they both had the same name. So, and then later I realized, well, certain other standards apply, but I didn't care. I just read everything.
Nick, you were a Tintin fan.
I loved, yes, that's true. I really loved Hergé, and I loved the way he drew Tibetan rocks. And the way, when Captain Haddock got drunk, the way he would fly out of the snow and go chasing after. So I read a lot of Tintin. Then I was hit by Lord of the Rings, and that was sort of the thing that I tried to read it in second grade, and I really, really didn't get it. And I confused Sauron and Saruman, but I had this big book that I carried around with me. Then I read it again in third grade, and it was really the most incredible reading experience. I remember lying on the couch, this crushed velvet couch that we had, and just trying to find different positions and counting the number of pages and the excitement of being in the midst of something so enormous. I love that. And then I got into science fiction. A friend of my father's was a science fiction guy, and he just delivered this massive stack of very well-thumbed yearly anthologies, that kind of thing, and just stacked them up on the iron. I remember they were on the ironing board, and I just I took them away and read them all and loved them. And I thought, well, I want to be a writer and write science fiction. So I started, that was in fourth grade. I said, I actually wrote a couple of stories based on the science fiction idea. One was called Gasp. Gasp. That was when the world's atmosphere went away.
Who are your favorite science fiction authors?
Well, I don't remember now. The guy's name, I love the guy's name. His name was Robert Sheckley. Shards of Space. Wow, wow, wow. I love that one.
Anne, what were you reading as a child?
I read whatever my sister had finished reading. I read Charlotte's Web, which was hugely important to me and changed my life. Still, to this day, I'm living in the world of Charlotte's Web. I read the Little House on the Prairie books. I read all of my sister's Nancy Drew books. You know, nothing interesting, just exactly what everybody was supposed to read. And then when I was 13, I read Humboldt's Gift. And I
Slight shift.
I just went directly from Little House on the Prairie to Humboldt's Gift, which was lying around. And I reread that book this last year, and it was fascinating because I remembered every word of it. It was completely imprinted on my brain. And also, when my grandmother was dying 10 years ago, I was having a really hard time finding the right thing to read to her, and I ended up reading her all of the Little House on the Prairie books again, which are really, Pa had a lot of problems. He was really...
Yes, he was a difficult man.
He was really difficult. But again, I mean, I could almost close the book and recite the next page. Your brain is such a sponge when you're young, and all of those things really stick.
One of the great things I'll recommend is actually listening to Charlotte's Web. There's an audio recording that E.B. White does himself, and it's so amazing to hear, you know, how he imagined the goose and her little idiosyncratic speech patterns. When I asked you who your literary hero was, Anne, you said Wilbur. Why?
Well, I lived on a farm in Tennessee when I was a kid, and I wanted a pig. I got a pig for my 9th birthday, not one of those little Vietnamese potbelly pigs, but the way pigs used to be. You know, it was small for a couple of weeks, and it was my dog, and it grew up to be 350 pounds, and I became a vegetarian like 3 days after my 9th birthday. And because I wouldn't eat my dog and I wouldn't eat my pig, and that was it. So that book had a huge impact on me.
Did you have a literary hero, either as a child or now?
Well, I suppose as a child it was Aragorn. Strider was in The Lord of the Rings, and Captain Haddock, some mixture of the two.
Francine?
Well, I liked all those, very basic, empowered girls of, Pippi Longstocking and Joe. I mean, it was so to speak, textbook, but they really meant a lot to me.
Walter, other than Spider-Man?
It has to be other? No. I always have a problem with talking about writing to readers, because readers think a lot about reading, and I don't know what writers think, but I don't think a lot about reading, and I rarely think that reading has anything to do with writing. I don't equate them. They're two different things. I like them both, so the guy who I like the most is Homer, because not only was he illiterate, he was also blind, so all he could do is tell stories about things that he had picked up. And that's kind of the way I think of writing, that you're telling these kind of large, big stories, and they're in your head. And it doesn't have to do with other people, telling stories or writing books or anything like that, that the books are something different. They're wonderful, and they do connect, and is that you tell the story and it gets published, but that's where it ends.
I'd like to believe that everyone is readers, but as we know from polls, only about 50% of Americans have read at least one book for pleasure in the last year, and that statistic kind of remains static. So I do think that the world divides into people who are readers and those who aren't. Do you remember, was there a time when you became a reader or someone who inspired you, Walter?
Oh, no, the same thing as my parents. My parents would, they would sit there and they would read. That would be the thing they would go to. I mean, they would watch television, they would tell stories, they would do all kinds of other things, but they would be reading books, and they got me books, they had their own books, there are books everywhere, and I just said, well, this must be important.
Francine, was it preordained with your name? I'm sure you get that question all the time, but was there a moment for you?
Well, I was a very early reader. I guess I was just 4, and I learned the way I think a lot of kids do, just by memorizing and pretending that I could read, and then suddenly I could read. But it was a kind of a party trick for me, because my parents would say, look at her, she can read. And then I would read for their guests, so it was just this weird little performance I would do. And then I discovered I liked it also in private, so that's how it happened.
Well, there's nothing wrong with you if you don't like reading, I don't think. I mean, honestly, I think there are lots of people who have very complicated, interesting thoughts who might only read a couple of books a year.
Yeah.
My father wasn't a reader. He liked to read the New York, he was a reader. He read words, but he wasn't a book reader. And I was amazed by how much he knew by reading the kinds of things he read, art catalogs and the New York Times and just more ephemeral things. I don't think people necessarily have to read books. I'm not a very good reader, honestly. I'm not a terribly good reader. I read a lot, but I look at the way my wife reads books. She's read all of Trollope, and she just reads it, and there's a kind of joy, and it sorts out her life as she's reading the book in a way that doesn't happen for me. And I'm very jealous of it, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not that kind of reader, and yet I've managed to survive. So I think it's okay. It's okay if you, what I've been hit with recently is the Flashman series. George MacDonald Fraser, he's a terribly objectionable British Empire sort of chap, and he goes around doing terrible things all over the world, and it's a P.G. Wodehouse combined with the Sharp novels by Bernard Cornwell, and he's funny and objectionable, and I actually felt some of that feeling of wanting to go from book to book, because there are a lot of books that I think real readers feel in reading these Flashman series.
And you're a Doris Kearns Goodwin completist, you
I am.
said. Are there writers that you feel like you just have to read every single thing they write?
I'll ask somebody else and let me think on that.
I'll let you think on that. I'll ask you this: did you grow up surrounded by books? Did you come from a reading family? How did you become a reader?
My parents were great readers. I have no memory of either of my parents ever reading to us, but they always were saying, "Go away, we're reading." And I can remember.
That's the way to do it.
I think that actually is the way to do it, to show your child that you're in an important relationship with a book. My parents were divorced when I was very young, and actually we only saw our father a week a year. Long, sad story, but it has nothing to do with the price of plane tickets. But I remember when I was very, very young, going to visit my father, and he was reading The Godfather, the first Godfather. And he couldn't even look up. I mean, he really loved us. He was really happy we were there, but he was so stuck with it. And I remember so well, I was 8 or something, him saying he cut the head off the horse and he put the head in the guy's bed. My father was a cop in Los Angeles. And we were like, no, they cut the head off the horse. And somehow I think that was better than him reading Green Eggs and Ham to us.
I have to say, I do feel like that's one of the beautiful points that you reach in parenthood, where your child is independently reading, and so at night you can say, "Would you like me to read to you, or should we just read our own books side by side?"
Oh, yeah, that's a sad moment, though.
It's bittersweet. Do you have a favorite author? This is such an unfair question, and everyone's going to probably name someone dead. But Nick, and you can answer with 5 names.
No,
if that
no,
makes it
I
easier.
think, I mean, to be honest, as soon as you said favorite author, it was like the old 8-ball toy where something comes up and it has to be Nabokov. He is not an idiomatic writer of English, and yet he had this desire to match up words with things in a way that just still, when I read him, I think, oh my God. When I was 15, I read this description that he made of riding in a train looking at telegraph wires, and the telegraph wires were beaten down every so often by the poles, and I thought, oh my God, I know, I've ridden in the back of a car, and I've looked out a car, and I've seen telephone poles, and they do the exact same thing, and that exciting feeling that somebody is able to look at the world, pull it down and put it into words, and then it goes into my mind, and the same thing happens. So he has to be still my favorite writer.
Francine?
Oh, I couldn't possibly. I mean, first of all, that question, I can't, every time I'm asked, every book I've ever read, I just feel them circling the drain and going down. But
I know that's like when someone comes up to you and says, what should I read next?
Right,
And then your mind just empties out.
read any good books lately? There are hundreds of them.
Walter?
I like that read any good books lately. That means they want to have sex with you, right?
That's what that meant?
Yeah. For me, it's never authors. It's always books. I love the Four Quartets, but not T.S. Eliot. I think The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus are just incredible books. But everything Camus has written, I don't love. I really like David Copperfield, but that doesn't mean I'm reading everything that Dickens wrote. I mean, it's all because writers are uneven. Writers have different interests, like me. So there are books that I like, and then I have nice feelings toward the writers because they wrote them. But it's not like that's everything that somebody wrote is going to be mine.
I love asking questions, which is one of the reasons I started a Q&A, and I have about 5 other index cards here, each with 5 questions on them. But given the constraints of time, I want to invite everyone to ask your questions. So if you want to go up to the microphone, if you have any questions
And
for the
while they're
authors.
doing that, can I answer that last
Yes.
question?
Ah, good.
Because with the writers that I read when I was growing up, who were the people that my mother and stepfather read, who I read through high school and college and graduate school, this is so weird, but it's Bellow, Updike, and Roth for me. And even though there are good books and bad books, my very favorite books are really those 3, The Human Stain and Rabbit at Rest and Humboldt's Gift.
That's like a literary showdown kind of question where you go, okay, Bellow, Roth, or Updike, which one?
It's such a cliche, though. These are my guys. I don't know.
All right, we will turn to your questions.
Okay, I need recommendations from as many as we'll give them. Having exhausted Anthony Trollope and Jane Austen, who would be in that world that I could read?
We're going back to 19th century England.
With some wit. It doesn't have to be England, but some, story, plot, character with some wit, like them.
Read Nancy Mitford, Love in a Cold Climate and In Pursuit of Love. You're nodding because you've already read them. Yes? Oh, you haven't? Okay. Also, a book that I just finished reading a couple of days ago, Barbara Trapedio, Brother to the More Famous Jack. I loved. I can't explain to you why that connects, but it does. These are new books. Barbara Trapedio. If you go to parnassusbooks.net, I write all of these things down, and they're all there. Also, if you love those books, you should read Liz Gilbert's novel, The Signature of All Things, because she goes back and reimagines those heroines, I think, in a really meaningful way.
What happened to Jerzy Kosinski? Is he still, I could probably find out on the internet, is he still with us?
No.
Painted Bird and the like wrote,
Oh,
he's
no,
gone?
he
He's
killed
gone.
himself.
Yeah.
Oh my.
Yeah.
He was discouraged. Somebody said that he had had help with one of his books, translational help that maybe verged into other kinds of help. He seemed to be depressed, and I think he felt his work was done. So he just checked out.
Thank you.
Ms. Paul, please tell us about your book club. I've been in one almost 40 years.
Oh gosh, okay, this was something I was going to bring up later, which was literary controversies, and should one read books for children if one is not a child. I belong, actually, to a children's book club for several reasons. One, because the books are short, and I therefore I'm never asked to read, Karl Ove Knausgaard, Volume 3, by next month. I have a lot of books to read for work. The second reason is because the people in it, this was a book club that had been in existence. It formed under the author Gretchen Rubin, who wrote The Happiness Project and several other books. And the book club has become so popular, there are now 3 branches. Next week we have the Tri-Kidlet Holiday Book Party. And the people in it are authors and literary critics, people who work within publishing, many of whom don't have children, but like children's literature. And for me, one of the things that I love about children's literature is that these are the books that made us readers. These are the books that hooked us. There is an emphasis on story and on the sort of themes that touch the human heart in children's literature that will always speak to me, and also enable me to stay in that world. I have 3 children, and I used to be the children's book editor at the Times before I was, as my children say, demoted. So that's my book club.
Question for Ann Patchett. Has owning a bookstore changed you as a writer, and if so, how?
It probably has, because I don't have as much time to write. My new book is a book of essays, and I know that I wrote that book because I had a bookstore, and I couldn't just disappear in the same way that I do when I write a novel. But I'm trying to get hold of my life, and I am writing a novel now. Because not only, when I opened this bookstore, I became such a big part of my community in Nashville, and I started speaking at schools and at Rotary clubs and moose lodges and hosting the homeless shelter fundraiser and the library gala. That's how it changed my life.
This shows how much a bookstore really serves a function in a community.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Especially now.
So I came a smidgen late, and I apologize if you've already answered this question, but you've thrown around the term good book, bad book. What makes a good book for each of you, I suppose?
Shall we start with Walter?
The first thing that makes a book good for me is the language itself. If I'm enjoying the language, the descriptions, the dialogue, and then after that comes in character and story, and I'm really political, so that at some point or another, if something can go awry politically for me, and it might turn me away, but if that doesn't happen, it's basically it's a lot, not just craft, but not always craft. It's how. It's the language and how well it flows forward for me.
Yeah, I agree with Walter. It's all about sentences for me.
Mm-hmm.
I like when somebody is funny and when I like the person. If I like the guy or gal who's writing the book, I think, okay, I'm willing to spend some time with this person. And I often have a sort of subversive streak where I want to read things that are genre books that aren't, or that are things that are not considered high literary books, because I've heard those names so often, and I want to find out what people are doing who are less celebrated, so.
Nicholson Baker reads romance novels, too.
Yeah, I love reading romance novels. I mean, they're dirty now, so that's.
For me, it's when I forget that I'm reading. It's when I stop looking at a book and thinking, oh, that's amazing the way they did that. That was so clever. That was a really smart idea. Look at the way they're presenting that character. When that part of my brain shuts off and I stop analyzing the book and figuring out how they did it, and I just fully enter into it, then it becomes a truly great book. I just finished reading Roz Chast's book. Can't we talk about something more pleasant? And I never read graphic novels. So to be reading a graphic novel and have that part of my brain just click off, I was just with her every second.
That's great.
For me, it's about being transported. I don't want to read about, other neurotic people my age in New York, dealing with family and work. I want to be, off in the Congo.
Can I recommend an Ishiguro novel called The Buried Giant?
Yes.
Yesterday, we heard a wonderful presentation from Walter Isaacson on his new book, The Innovators. And I was curious if any of you spend much time reading nonfiction books.
I probably read more nonfiction than fiction.
Yeah, go
No,
ahead.
go, please.
Well, I mean, I write nonfiction, so I have to read to read a lot of nonfiction books in order to sift through what other people have said, and it's also it's kind of nice to alternate. I think to be in an imagined world is kind of enveloping in a different way. But when you're reading a nonfiction book, the person gets all sorts of points for telling the truth, and I like the truth. So I read probably as much or more nonfiction than fiction.
Yeah, I read a lot of I mean, when you've been out of school for a million years, you're by necessity an autodidact. So if you're going to learn anything,
That's true.
You have to keep up your reading.
I do too. Recently, I bought this thing that was published in the 30s called the Educator Library. It's 11-volume college education for soldiers who went to war and couldn't, because you could only go to school when you're 18 at some point. And so if you're like 25, you're an old guy, so you can't go. But it was like a whole college education. And because it's before computers and before jet engines, they explain almost everything that you can do, how to build a plane, how to, it's kind of wonderful. And I love stuff like that. And I like history too. I like reading the Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant, it's kind of wonderful.
I read a lot of nonfiction. I also listen to a lot of nonfiction. I'm not so good at listening to fiction, but I listen to nonfiction. And my favorite book this year is a nonfiction book, Hector Tobar's Deep Down Dark, the story of the trapped Chilean miners.
Here in Miami.
Brilliant book.
Thank you. We have to bring this session to a close. I didn't know if you wanted to wrap it up and
No.
with any closing remarks.
No rapping.
The audience looks sad. Look at them.
They do. That's
You
a
can
good
still
sign.
hang out here and corner us with questions after, except for Nicholson Baker, who has to go off or go to his next session. Thank
Great.
you
Let's
so
have
much.
a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.